Well, it's my joy and pleasure to be back with the Rockliff congregation again on Wednesday night for Bible study. I've enjoyed so much being here with you, and I hope that we can make these next few Wednesday nights spiritually profitable to all of us. I've chosen to call our series of lessons Studies About Small Things. And I hope that we can explain that as we go along. And the first part of our study tonight, I want to try to show you what my goal is. What do I intend by this? What do we hope to accomplish by the end of our study? I want you to first of all turn to Zechariah chapter 4, verse 10. That's the next to the last book in the Old Testament. That'll help you find it. Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 10. Now before 9 and 10, now before I read that text, you will recall that the people of Judah were carried away into captivity for a period of 70 years. Before they were allowed to return, and at the time of their captivity, the temple had been destroyed, and then of course later on the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed as well. Now when the Jews returned, they returned with the intent of rebuilding the temple. That was their first object. That was their first goal. But they had opponents. They had opposition in this. They had misunderstanding not only within themselves, but particularly with the Samaritans and some of the others that were in the land of Palestine that wanted to stop and to hinder that work. In fact, they ridiculed the Jews for thinking that they could actually rebuild a temple. And they sort of had the attitude, what does the feeble Jews think they're going to be able to build? They're not going to be able to do this. They're not capable of doing that. Well, of course, we know they did it nonetheless. But when they started out on it, they sort of got discouraged, and for a number of years they didn't proceed with their construction like they should have. There was a prophet named Haggai, and also this prophet in Zechariah, who motivated the people to gather themselves together and to get back to work and to do the work that they had set out to do in rebuilding the temple, and not to pay attention to their opponents that would discourage them. And then in this 4th chapter, in verse 9, the hands of Zerubbabel, and he was going to be the leader of the Jews in this recovery, have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also finish it. And thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts has sent me unto you. Now watch. For who hath despised the day of small things? Now what did he have in mind? He said, for they shall rejoice and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel with those 7. Now look on this word plummet. A plummet was simply a little ball or a little artifice of lead that they would tie to a string, and they'd get up high and they'd let that lead down and string, and it would give you a perfect circular measure. They'd talk about things being plumb. We talk about how things are plumb today. Now they don't use, I don't know, maybe contractors still use plummets, but they usually use microscopes and so forth today, use instruments. But that was just a little bitty old thing, but that was the thing that they used to build the walls of that temple. Just a small thing. These enemies said, you can't do it. And they said, we can. And said, don't despise the day of small things. Zerubbabel and the builders were using small things to accomplish what God wanted done. The course of our study is going to be designed to show that God uses what we would call small things. And we will see the effect and the necessity of small things. Small events, small tools, small people that we might call small people. There's really no such thing as a small person, I guess. Relatively speaking, there might be. But I hope that we can study and to realize we're not really small. We count, brethren. We matter. You know, Will Rogers says there's importance for nearly everybody. He says even in a parade, everybody goes, watches the parade go by, and they see the hero on the float. But there's some other important people there too. There are people sitting on the curb that are clapping as they go by. Now, what sort of parade would you have if you didn't have anybody to clap when they went by? You see, they have a small role, all right, and it's not the most prominent, but they are important. I suppose most of us have heard or read at some time or another that little ditty about the loss of a nail. I want to read it to you again. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost off of a horse. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of the horse, the rider was lost. For the loss of the rider, the message was lost. For the want of the message, the battle was lost. And for the loss of the battle, the kingdom was lost. How important was the nail? Well, you see, it was a small thing, but it was highly significant, wasn't it? Someone has said that little strokes fell big oaks. You cut down a tree, just one lick doesn't seem to be too much. But it's important to hit that first lick. If you don't hit the first one, you can't hit the second one. And so the first one is important. The Chinese had a proverb that says, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with that first step. Well, that first step is important. One has said, if you're too big for small things, you may be too small for big things. Well, that's something to consider also. Well, what I hope that we can see, that we can accomplish things though we may not be the most prominent. We may not be considered to be the most important, but we matter. And what we do matters. And what we say is significant and important. It all goes into place. You know, God waters the earth, but He does it with tiny little raindrops, doesn't He? Every one of them has a certain significance and importance about it. Now, what I want us to do is to probably look at situations with which you already have a familiarity, but which include small things that demonstrate the importance of how small things put into the service of God become important things because God looks upon them as being important. The first thing I would like for us to consider is in the New Testament. And if you'll turn with me in the New Testament to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. Now this is getting toward the end of the ministry of Jesus Christ. And beginning with verse 3, and being in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he, that's Christ, sat at meat, there came a woman having alabaster box of ointment of spikenard very precious. And she brake the box and poured it on his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, why was this waste of the ointment made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence and have been given to the poor. and they murmured against her. And Jesus said, Let her alone. Why trouble ye her? She hath wrought a good work on me. For ye have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will ye may do them good. But me ye have not always. And here's the significant phrase. She hath done what she could. She is come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. Now they didn't understand what Jesus was saying to them at that particular time. This box of ointment, it was considered some importance to give to the poor, all right. We think that this may have been Mary Magdalene that did this, but this wasn't a great momentous action on her part, was it? This was a rather simple deed that she did by which she intended to honor the Lord. And the Lord knew that in just a short while he was going to be crucified and would be buried, and he said, She has done this to anoint my body for the burying. But the important thing, as small as some might consider what she did, she had done what she could. Now, folks, I believe that when we do what we can and what we're capable of doing, and especially when we do what we ought to be doing, it has a significance. It is importance. It's not to just be brushed aside. What you did today mattered. What you said today mattered. What we thought today mattered. The fact that you have come here for worship and study tonight, that matters. You know, there are a lot of people that don't think much of Wednesday night. I don't know what's wrong with those people. They're sort of twisted in the head if they think they don't have enjoyment out of being present for a Bible study. But a lot of people don't think much of it. Now, Sunday morning on Easter and Christmas, whoopee, now that matters. That's you pay your dues and that's it. And Wednesday night, there won't be many there, and they do that all the time, and that's not a big deal, and we don't have to go, and yes, it is a big deal. And you considered it important. I'm not flattering you, but I am commending you for your presence, because what you have done has a significance. And that is true of everything in life. Are you in agreement with me on that, or do I stand alone? I don't think I stand alone. If anybody disagrees, why, you can just feel yourself dismissed. But I suppose that everybody knows about this small matter of which we read in Matthew the 14th chapter. It's in John the 6th chapter. It's in Matthew, and it's also found in other places, but we'll read it from John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Now, here's where some small things really mattered. I believe he said that clock is out of whack, and I believe it is, because I've been talking here a few minutes and I haven't moved it at all. But I've got something up here that tells me it's still moving, and I feel sure that when time comes, somebody will probably be courteous enough to tell me to hush. Now, John chapter 6. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. And when Jesus lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Which shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There's a lad here which had 5 barley loaves, and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together, that filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Now notice the result. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. Now they were talking about something that Moses had predicted, that you read about in the 18th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, where he said there will become a prophet to whom you'll give your allegiance. It's to him, he's the one you will be listening to. And of course Moses and Elijah confirmed that at the Mount of Transfiguration, when God says, This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased, hear ye him. But the people were looking for such a prophet. In fact, they thought John the Baptist for a while was that prophet, but John the Baptist wasn't that prophet. Here is that prophet. And these people, seeing the things that Jesus did in feeding the 5,000, they began to believe more and more. This is the prophet that Moses and the others had foretold that was to come. How important is it, folks, for them and for us to understand that Jesus the Christ is the prophet that was to come? Can you place a premium on that? How exalted he is in the miracles that he did, and how did he come about? Well, it says there was a lad there. Didn't even call his name. Just a lad, not even a grown person. I don't know where he got his 5 barley loaves, 2 fishes. Somebody said he was at his sack lunch on the way to school and just stopped off to go with Jesus. I don't know about all that. But he had it. But with 5,000 men, how in the world what's that? Is that not a small thing? You couldn't get much smaller when you had the task of wanting to feed such a host of people as that. You don't know who the lad was. You don't know where he got his little supply. And it was such a drop in the bucket as far as being able to do anything was concerned. And yet, when that small thing was given into the service that the Lord prescribed, look what was accomplished. It caused the people to think, this is the prophet. Now, they wouldn't have thought that if there hadn't have been the feeding of the 5,000. And there wouldn't have been the feeding of the 5,000 from this nothing if they hadn't had that little bit. You see what I'm saying to you? How small things matter? How small things used in the service of God bring forth things that are exceptionally important. Well, let's look at another. And let's look at Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. Small thing. Verse 41. Now this is also recorded in Matthew and Luke, but we're reading from Mark. Mark 12:41. And Jesus sat over against the treasury, You're familiar with this. And beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and how many that were rich cast in much. Let me pause right there. Isn't that what you'd expect? Rich people, they can give a lot, can't they? Folks that don't have much can't give a whole lot. They can give, but they can't give a whole lot. But rich people can give a whole lot, and it doesn't hurt them a bit. One time a fellow asked, how much should you give? He said, you ought to give till it hurts. Well, he was so stingy, it hurt him to give anything. But he said, to give till it hurts. Another fellow says, you ought to give till it feels good. You're just so cheerful and glad to be liberal with what God has blessed you. Why, you give till it makes you feel good. Well, these rich were given, and they were giving much. And verse 42 says, there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. Now that's not much. And he called unto him his disciples, and said unto them, verily I say unto you, that this poor widow has cast more in than all they which is cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Now, who was this woman? We don't know. Her name is not even given. She was just a widow. She was in poverty. She didn't have much upon which to cast her living, but she gave it all into the treasury. And the Lord uses this to teach us a lesson about giving, doesn't he? Sacrificial giving. Giving because you cheerfully give to the service of God. It's not how much you give altogether. That does matter some. But it's how you give. What's your motive? What do you intend by it? What are you trying to accomplish by the giving that you do? The Lord teaches us great lessons about giving with this small amount, 2 mites that make a farthing. This poor unnamed woman. Now we might count her as being sort of an unimportant person. Well, she's not one of the more prominent people of the New Testament. But the lesson that is taught by what she did is prominent in the new covenant of Christ, is it not? Do we not see how that small things given into the service of God become important things, important spiritual things, even for us today? I mean, pause right here. Does anyone have any comment that you would like to make about the situations that you're familiar with? All these situations I'm going to bring out, because you've studied your Bible and you know about them all, but we probably read over them and we don't dwell, naturally, we don't dwell upon the little minute details and particulars, and that's what I'm causing us to try to focus our attention so we can get the idea of things that are small or important. Anybody have any comment on any of these things?
Think how much has been given since her example. Those little 2 mites, think how many have read this through the years and said, I'm going to give more. So let's just multiply exceedingly.
There's just no telling how much contribution has been increased by her 2 mites. Yes, Brother Tommy.
I think it's interesting how that Jesus was watching these people in verse 41. He says he saw how they cast their money in. He was looking at these people and he was seeing how nonchalant or how they thought about what they were doing.
Do you think the Lord is watching when time comes for us to contribute? Do you think the fact that we folded that dollar bill up so small it just looked like a paper wad that he doesn't know how much it is? And the fellows that counted, this tight wad, he just, I can't hardly get this thing open. But yes, I think the Lord is mindful of us at the time that we make our contribution.
It says he sat over against the wall.
Yeah. In fact, he's mindful of us when we think about, what am I going to do today? How am I going to give today? He's mindful of that. All right, good comments. Now let's look at Acts chapter 9. And Acts chapter 9 is one of the accounts that we have in the New Testament where we have the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. And I read the first 9 verses. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth, and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he, stumbling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, and neither did eat nor drink. Now, before we comment too much, let's move over to the 22nd chapter of Acts and look at that right quickly. Acts 22, beginning with verse 7. And Paul is recounting this. He said, I fell to the ground, heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? He said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me and saw indeed the light, but were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. Now they heard a voice, but they didn't understand the voice. That's the harmony between the two passages. And he said, What shall I do? He said, Rise, go to Damascus, and there it shall be told thee the things that are appointed for thee. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came to Damascus. As our time passes out, I raise the question, how important were the men that led Paul into Damascus? Did they matter? Did they count? Oh, they were just traveling with Paul. They were probably enemies of Christianity also, traveling along with Paul or Saul. But did they not render a great service? There's not a single one of them that's named. They're not even important enough for the Holy Spirit to tell us who they were. Did they not do a good thing? Were they not important in the conversion of Saul of Tarsus? They took him by the hand and led him to where he needed to go, to where he could learn what he needed to learn and what he was supposed to do. I think as these men might sit around the fire someday and think about Saul of Tarsus becoming Paul the Apostle, and they could say, why, we are the one that led him to the place where Ananias came to him and told him to rise and be baptized and wash away his sins. Ananias that told him he was going to go to the Gentiles as well as to the Jews. I think these were important people. Don't you? What if they hadn't led him in? I raise questions so many times I guess I should. What if? What if? Well, you can just get off in all kind of tangents, so if you just what if yourself to death. But what if they hadn't complied with leading Paul into the place where he needed to be. Why, it'd have been a whole different story. He couldn't see. He couldn't have gotten there by himself. I think they rendered a great service to the cause of Jesus Christ in bringing this matchless apostle to the place that he did. Now, we have some more, and I don't know that we'll be able to. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead with one more. Going right quick. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. We can do it. Go back to Acts chapter 9. Go back to Acts chapter 9 and look at verse 20. Now, after Saul of Tarsus was converted, he began to preach the gospel of Christ right there in the very same city where he had come for the purpose of persecuting Christians. But now he was preaching the very Christ whom he had been persecuting. In Acts chapter 9, beginning verse 20, and straightway he preached Christ in the synagogues, that he's the Son of God. But all that heard him were amazed and said, Is not this he that destroyed them which called on this name in Jerusalem, and came hither for that intent, that he might bring them bound unto the chief priest? But Saul increased the more in strength, and confounded the Jews which dwelt at Damascus, proving that this is the very Christ. And after that many days were fulfilled, notice, the Jews took counsel to kill him. But their laying await was known of Saul, and they that watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down by the wall in a basket. My point, how important were those men that let Paul down in that basket? You say, oh, we don't even know who they were. It don't make any difference who they were. How important were they? They helped to spare the life of this man that was probably the greatest missionary the cause of Christ has ever seen. The writing of the New Testament, so much of it. The conversion of Jews and Gentiles. They helped to spare his life when there were the enemies who were there and who were capable and who were determined to kill him. And they did something that, well, you think maybe is not so important. But it might have been pretty heavy to let a man down in a basket. Probably took more than one of them. But I suggest to you that those men put a star in their crown when they rendered that service. Were they small men? They might be counted small with a lot of people. I just imagine that the Apostle Paul considered them to be pretty big, don't you? They helped him to spare his life and to go into his mission, the wonderful mission that he performed. Did anybody think any comments about these small people that led Paul, small people that lowered him in the basket? I think they were small people, probably like most of us. I don't know that I could have done what they did. I would have probably dropped him and he would have not made it. But they had the strength and the determination, and they were willing to run the risk to do it. Yes, Tommy. Was that? Did I take your?
Their courage. That's what I was talking about.
Okay, because if they would have killed him, they would have killed his deliverers as well. They were risking their lives also. I think they were great people, small people, but great people.